Paul McCartney started reading the letter. On the third line, he stopped and went completely silent. Jimmy Fallon froze mid-interview because a Beatles legend was crying on live television. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. March 2024. Another Thursday night taping. Another packed audience. Another legendary musical guest. Paul McCartney, still sharp at 81, still touring, still creating, still being Paul McCartney. Sat in the guest chair across from Jimmy, telling stories the way he'd done on talk shows for 60 years. The audience was eating it up. Jimmy was laughing at all the right moments. The Roots were providing musical punctuation. It was perfect late-night television. Standard interview. Standard rhythm. Paul talking about his latest project, sharing a Beatles anecdote, making the audience laugh with his Liverpool charm. Then a production assistant walked onto the stage during the commercial break and handed Jimmy a manila envelope. "What's this?" Jimmy asked, looking at the unmarked envelope. The PA leaned in close. "A woman in the audience. She's been waiting 30 years to give this to Paul. She asked if there was any way." Jimmy looked at the envelope, then out at the audience. An elderly woman in the third row was staring at him, hands clasped together, tears already streaming down her face. 30 years? Jimmy whispered. The PA nodded. She said it's a letter? From someone who died. She promised she'd get it to Paul McCartney before she died too. The commercial break was ending. Jimmy made a split-second decision. He kept the envelope. The cameras came back. Jimmy smiled his familiar smile. "We're back with the legendary Paul McCartney." The audience applauded. Paul waved. Everything normal. Except Jimmy was holding the envelope in his lap where the cameras couldn't see it. They finished the current segment, Paul talking about writing. Let It Be. The story he told 1,000 times but still told beautifully. The audience loved it. Jimmy loved it. But Jimmy kept glancing at the envelope. During the next commercial break, Jimmy leaned forward. "Paul, there's a woman in our audience. She has a letter for you. She's been carrying it for 30 years. She says it's from someone who's gone now. Would you?" "I mean, we don't have to do this on camera, but..." Paul's expression changed. The easy charm faded. "Who's it from?" "I don't know. She just said someone who died. Someone who wanted you to have this." Paul looked out at the audience, scanning the faces. His eyes found the elderly woman in the third row. She was still crying, still staring at him with desperate hope. "Yeah," Paul said quietly. "Yeah, I'll read it." Jimmy stopped mid-interview. Paul McCartney lowered the letter and said, "This isn't possible." No one in the studio knew that letter would reveal a 50-year-old secret. The cameras came back from commercial. Jimmy's producer was screaming in his earpiece. This wasn't in the show rundown. They had a musical performance scheduled. What was he doing? Jimmy took out his earpiece and set it on his desk. A move that said, "I don't care about the schedule. This matters more." "Folks," Jimmy said, addressing the audience, "we're going to do something a little different. There's a woman here tonight who's been waiting a very long time to deliver something to Paul. Ma'am, would you mind standing up?" The elderly woman stood shakily. She was maybe 75, wearing a simple dress, clutching a tissue. The cameras found her immediately. "What's your name?" Jimmy asked gently. "Margaret," she said, her voice barely carrying through the studio. "Margaret Foster." "And you have something for Paul?" "I made a promise," Margaret said, her voice stronger now. "To my brother. Before he died. I promised I'd get this letter to Paul McCartney. I've been trying for 30 years. I've written to his management. I've gone to concerts. I could never get close enough. And then I won these tickets and I thought maybe this was meant to be." Paul was leaning forward in his chair now, completely focused on Margaret. The studio had gone silent. "Your brother," Paul said. "What was his name?" "David." David Foster. You knew him in Liverpool. In 1963. Before everything. Paul's face went pale. Davey Foster? Margaret nodded, tears flowing freely now. He died in 1994. Cancer. Before he died, he wrote you a letter. He made me promise I'd get it to you. He said you'd understand why it mattered. Jimmy looked at Paul, then at Margaret, then at the envelope in his hands. Paul, do you want to read it now? Or we can. No, Paul said firmly. If Davey wrote it, I want to read it now. Jimmy stood and walked the envelope to Margaret first. Would you like to give it to him yourself? Margaret walked down from the third row on shaking legs. The audience watched in absolute silence. Security helped her navigate the steps. She reached the stage, and Paul McCartney, one of the most famous human beings who ever lived, stood up and took both her hands in his. Davey was your brother? Paul asked softly. Yes. He talked about you all the time. About the Cavern Club. About the nights you'd all sit around and dream about making it big. He said you were going to change the world, and you did. Why didn't he ever reach out? After the Beatles took off? Margaret's face crumpled. He tried. He wrote letters. They never got through. And then he got sick. And he ran out of time. Paul pulled her into a gentle hug. The audience was crying. Jimmy was standing off to the side, not interfering, just bearing witness. Margaret pulled back and handed Paul the envelope. He wanted you to know. Before he died, he wanted you to know. Paul took the envelope with trembling hands. Margaret returned to her seat, helped by Jimmy and a production assistant. Paul stood center stage, alone under the lights, holding a letter from a ghost. He opened it carefully. Pulled out 3 handwritten pages. The paper was old, slightly yellowed, the handwriting shaky but legible. Paul began to read silently. His lips moved slightly. His expression changed from line to line, confusion, then recognition, then shock, then something that looked like grief mixed with joy. On the 3rd page he stopped. His hands lowered slowly. He looked up at nothing in particular, his eyes unfocused. This isn't possible, he whispered, but the microphones caught it. Jimmy stepped closer. Paul? Are you okay? Paul didn't answer. He just stared at the letter like it had reached across 30 years and grabbed him by the throat. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. To understand what Paul read in that letter, you need to understand who David Foster was. In 1963, Paul McCartney wasn't Paul McCartney yet. He was just Paul, a 21-year-old bassist in a band called the Beatles that was starting to get popular in Liverpool. They played the Cavern Club most nights. Crowds were getting bigger. Local girls were screaming. But they weren't famous. Not yet. David Foster was a dock worker's son who loved music but couldn't play an instrument to save his life. He'd come to the Cavern Club every chance he got, standing in the back, watching Paul and John and George and Ringo create something magic in that sweaty underground cave. Paul and Davey became friends the way young men do. Over pints after shows, walking home through Liverpool streets at 2 a.m., talking about dreams and futures and whether the Beatles would ever make it beyond Merseyside. Davey had his own dream. He wanted to be a writer. Not songs, stories. Books. He'd fill notebooks with ideas, characters, plots. He'd read his favorite passages to Paul while they waited for the bus or sat on the docks watching ships come in. You're going to be famous, Davey would say. The whole world's going to know your name. And you're going to write the great British novel. Paul would reply. And I'll tell everyone I knew you when. It was the kind of promise young men make when the future feels infinite. Then the Beatles exploded. Love Me Do. Hit the charts in late 1962. Please Please Me went to number 1 in early 1963. Suddenly Paul and the band weren't local heroes. They were national sensations on their way to becoming global phenomenons. The last time Paul saw Davey was in March 1963. The Beatles were about to leave for their first national tour. Davey came to see them off at the train station. "This is it, isn't it?" Davey said. "You're really going?" "We'll be back," Paul promised. "And when we are, I want to read whatever you've written." "Deal," Davey said. "Go change the world, mate. I'll be here when you get back." But by the time the Beatles returned to Liverpool, they weren't the same band. And somehow, in the chaos of Beatlemania, Paul lost track of Davey. He meant to reach out. He always meant to. But there were tours and recordings and films and screaming crowds and the entire world demanding every minute of every day. Years passed. Davey wrote letters. Dozens of them. Sent to fan club addresses, to record labels, to management companies. None of them reached Paul. They got lost in the avalanche of fan mail, filtered out by assistants who didn't know David Foster was someone who mattered. Davey kept writing anyway. Not letters. The stories he'd promised himself he'd write. He got a job at the Liverpool Library. He never married. He lived a quiet life, filling notebooks with characters and plots, always meaning to finish something, always running out of time. In 1992, at age 50, Davey was diagnosed with lung cancer. Advanced. Inoperable. The doctors gave him 2 years if he was lucky. Davey decided to write one final letter. Not to Paul's management. Not to a fan club. To Paul himself. Knowing it would probably never arrive, but needing to write it anyway. His sister Margaret promised she'd deliver it. Somehow. Someday. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Paul was still standing on stage, the letter in his hands, unable to speak. Jimmy looked at his director, who was gesturing frantically to go to commercial, to save this for later, to control the situation. Jimmy shook his head. "No. This happens now. Live. Real." He walked over to Paul and gently guided him to sit down. Not in the guest chair, on the stage floor, backs against the desk. Breaking every rule of television blocking and staging. The audience watched in confused silence. The Roots had put down their instruments. The cameras kept rolling because nobody knew what else to do. Jimmy sat beside Paul on the floor. "Do you want to talk about it?" Paul looked at him, eyes wet. "Davey wrote songs." "What?" "In this letter. He says he wrote songs. After I left Liverpool. He couldn't play them, couldn't sing them, but he wrote them. Lyrics. Melodies written out in musical notation he taught himself. He wrote dozens of them. Paul's hands were shaking. He says in this letter that he never sent them to me because he didn't want me to think he was trying to ride my coattails. He didn't want to be the bloke who knew Paul McCartney before he was famous. He just wanted to write. For himself. "Where are the songs now?" "That's the thing," Paul said, his voice breaking. "He gave them to Margaret. Before he died. 30 years ago. She's been keeping them. Waiting for a chance to give them to me. And this letter says he doesn't want anything from me. No money, no credit, no fame. He's already gone. He just wanted me to see them. To know that he kept dreaming too." Paul wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "And he says? God, he says at the end here. He says you kept your promise, Paul. You changed the world. And I'm so proud of you. I just wanted you to know I kept writing. Like I said I would." The audience erupted into tears. Not sad tears, something more complicated. The tears that come when you witness something true and profound. Jimmy helped Paul stand. They walked to where Margaret was sitting. Paul crouched down beside her. "Do you have them? The songs?" Margaret pulled a worn leather notebook from her bag. "Every single one. 30 years I've kept them safe." Paul took the notebook with reverence. He opened it to the first page. Davey's handwriting. A song titled, "The Boy Who Left Liverpool." Paul read the first verse aloud, his voice barely steady. It was beautiful. Simple. Real. "Would you mind?" Paul asked Margaret. If I recorded one? Just one. I won't release it commercially. I'd like to play something he wrote. Margaret sobbed. He'd love that. He'd love that so much. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. 2 months later, Paul McCartney recorded The Boy Who Left Liverpool in Abbey Road Studios. He played it once, live, on The Tonight Show. Jimmy sat and listened, crying openly. The audience was silent except for quiet weeping. The song was never released. It sits in Paul's private collection. But he made a copy for Margaret. And the leather notebook? Paul keeps it in his studio, next to his bass. A reminder that some dreams don't need stadiums. Some dreams just need to be witnessed by the one person who promised they'd remember.